Okay, I think the question on everyone's lips, to be honest, in the UK at the moment is how quickly will the UK economy recover from the COVID pandemic? We're at a stage at the moment, beginning of July, where we're starting to reopen the economy. There's a lot of talk about what they call a V-shaped recovery, which is, heading into the crisis and a dramatic drop and then a rapid recovery. Is that what we're looking at? Will the economy recover rapidly? Others have said that the UK, when you look at the big scale of things on a global scale, the UK economy will probably be one of the worst hit economies. So there's a lot of discussion about how bad the damage will be and how quickly the British economy will recover. There are 8 things I want to talk about very briefly today. 8 factors that I think might help us answer some of those questions about the shape and the speed of the British recovery. My name is Dr Huw Macartney. I'm an associate professor in political economy at the University of Birmingham. This is a talk that I gave to the Politics Society at the University of Birmingham on the 14th of July. I apologize for the Zoom background. I've done a few videos for the Politics Society and the University of Birmingham students over the last couple of months, standing in front of a whiteboard. I've lost all energy, to be honest. It's getting close to the summer and I'm conserving as much energy as possible. So I'm sitting down for this one, and I thought I'd put the points up here on the side, but in the background rather than me standing there scribbling away. So apologies for that. What I want to talk about today, though, very briefly, is ostriches and crystal balls. This will be more like a mini lecture, like the first one that I did, rather than a longer video. So I apologize if it's a little too long for you to handle. But try and bear with me. I think some of the stuff we'll talk about will be hopefully interesting, certainly relevant to the British economy. So we're going to talk about ostriches and crystal balls very briefly. Psychologists tell us about something called the ostrich effect, where, when you're hit by a barrage of bad news, there is this tendency to try and bury your head in the sand. And I think we're at a stage, certainly when I walk around Birmingham, where I live now, it feels a little bit like that. Like people are a little bit unsure exactly what is going on. They want to return to some kind of normalcy, but they're aware that, people are still dying. We still have high infection rates. There's a lot of confusion out there. And I think one of the things that tends to happen, and I certainly feel this myself, is that desire to kind of bury your head in the sand. What I want us to try and do today is to avoid that tendency and to lift our heads up a little bit and look at some of the factors, 8 of them in particular, that might give us a bit of an indication of actually what's going on. There is so much information, so much bad news coming our way, so much information coming our way. It's sometimes hard to tell, and often what I think we do is to bury our heads rather than trying to take a sort of a rational perspective on some of these things. So I want to talk about ostrich and the ostrich effect very briefly, and also, crystal balls. I don't have any answers about these things right up until the COVID pandemic itself. I think I was in a state of denial about how serious this was going to be. I don't claim to sit here with any of the answers at all. In fact, what I'm going to do with these 8 points is to raise a set of questions, set of questions in my mind that I think we might have some indications about the answers to, but we really don't know. We don't know the answers at this stage. So, I don't make any claim to have divine insight on any of these things. There's going to be a little bit of crystal balling here in terms of thinking about the future. So what are the big issues that I think are going to determine or define our recovery? Well, number 1 on my list is obviously, I think, the waves, future successive waves of the COVID pandemic. Andy Haldane, the chief economist for the Bank of England, said recently that he thought that the 2nd, 3rd, 4th waves of the pandemic, yeah, I know, right? My thought initially was 2nd wave, okay, I can get that, but 3rd or 4th waves, whoa, okay, hold on a second, brace yourselves, buckle up your seatbelts here. But he said that, the 2nd, the 3rd, and the 4th waves of the pandemic will really determine the shape of the recovery. And the more I think about it, the more I think he's right. The extent to which we can contain the rise, the 2nd waves, the growth of the spread of the pandemic, the degree to which we can manage a kind of a normal range of human, social, economic activity, shopping and all those kind of things. These will be decisive factors. So the waves will be particularly important. I think they're particularly important for the British economy. And here's where, you know, if this was a short snapshot, then I would just kind of move on. But if this is a mini lecture, then we need to say something about the state of the British economy, the type of economy that we have. So if I was teaching a lecture about this, I would usually say, look, there are two different types of economy and kind of, you know, and these are ideal types, right? There's no, you know, these are kind of models, if you like. One end of that spectrum, as I describe it to students, is the kind of economy that produces a lot of stuff. Now, you might in the past have thought of something like maybe Germany or China. It manufactures a lot and it exports it. In these kind of ideal type models, we're at the other end of the spectrum, right? No offense to British producers and things, but generally speaking, we don't produce an awful lot of stuff anymore. No one's bending over backwards to buy British cars these days. What we tend to do is we tend to import a lot of stuff. That has a major implication for the kind of economy that we have. Let's not mention the B word, the Brexit word at the moment. We'll come back to that at the end. But that makes a big difference for the type of economy that we have. So our economy thrives a lot on sales, consumption, what they call domestic demand, basically people getting out to the shops and buying a lot of stuff. And so you kind of follow that train of argument through and you kind of go, okay, for people to be able to buy stuff, assuming factoring out credit and credit cards and things for the moment, what are we relying on? We're basically relying on people having enough what they call disposable income. So wages, people having enough money in their pocket is one factor. Also, secondly, consumer sentiment. Like if people don't feel safe going into shops, for example, or shopping centers, that's going to have an impact on the recovery. So at the moment, you know, a lot of studies are being done about those kind of things. And most of the studies are showing people are very cautious, understandably, probably, about going back into shopping centers. There's also the fact that there's a lot of people currently unemployed or on lower wages, and we're going to be hit by higher unemployment in future. So all of those things together mean that these questions for the British economy, the successive waves we're likely to have coming down the line, this makes a big difference, right? You know, wages, consumption, domestic demand, people getting out and shopping and spending, all of these kind of things. I don't think there's an answer to that at the moment. I think a lot of it is still to play for as the shopping centers reopen and all those kind of things, decisions about wearing masks or not. All of that kind of stuff is going to make a big difference, right? Point number one then about waves. Point number two is about credit rating agencies. What are the credit rating agencies? This is a question. Again, like I said, I don't have all the answers. The second thing I would say, though, is credit rating agencies have the potential to play a very decisive role in this economic recovery. I've got to be honest with you, I'm not a big fan of the credit rating agencies. I don't think they do a great job anyway. They were in line for a lot of criticism after the financial crisis. My opinion, not an awful lot changed with the credit rating agencies, but they play this really important role. Let me try and explain very briefly why. So currently, and as I said with all the videos I've done before, that may change, right? Anytime soon. But currently, UK borrowing costs for the government are incredibly low. Let me try and tell you a little bit about how low they are and why this matters. So it's currently the position that, you know, the borrowing costs, in a sense, are below zero. So it's a little bit like investors are lining up to pay the government to lend it money. Like, no one comes to my door these days. I don't know, whatever reason, maybe I smell. Anyway, that's not the point. I get Amazon people coming to my door, but imagine that there was someone knocking at my door today, right? Hopefully not during this video, and saying, Huw, I want to lend you £10,000. Hold on, I want to lend you £10,000 and I want to pay you £100, £500 to lend you that money. I mean, that sounds to me like a pretty good deal. Now, putting aside all the complexity, that's kind of the situation that the UK government finds itself in now. It's kind of bizarre, right? But borrowing costs are incredibly low. That has obviously big implications. It means it makes things like government spending on the furlough schemes and all that kind of stuff and supporting businesses very possible at the moment. But this is where let me point my finger at number 2, the ratings agencies have a really important role potentially to play. Because if the credit rating agencies start to downgrade sovereign debt, right, we start to pay more, put it very simply, right? If they downgrade sovereign debt, those borrowing costs for the government start to go up. That's why I say that one of the deciding factors could be what these rating agencies do. Rating agencies played a big role in the aftermath of the financial crisis. They played a huge role in the Eurozone sovereign debt crisis. And one implication could be that if the rating agencies make a decision, okay, look, UK or American or whatever sovereign debt is getting out of hand, and we're going to downgrade that sovereign debt, those borrowing costs increase. One implication could well be, because it's happened before, that certain governments, the UK included, make knee-jerk decisions to introduce things like austerity. Right, hold on a sec, we need to do something dramatic, we need to do something fast, we're living beyond our means, all that kind of discussion goes on again. Those decisions by credit rating agencies could lead to austerity, even though that's the one taboo term no one wants to talk about. No one wants to talk about austerity at the moment, but the credit rating agencies, let me not say any more about them because I should get upset, right? But the credit rating agencies could be a deciding factor in leading towards more austerity. So we talked about waves, we talked about ratings. Third thing, small and medium-sized enterprises, the SMEs up here, small firms. Will smaller firms cope? I'll come back to big firms in a minute or two, but will smaller firms cope? One thing that strikes me when I look at the economic data at the moment is there is just so much diversity. Different industries are being hit in different ways. Different firms in different industries are being hit in very different ways. My kids and I, we like to go to Frankie and Benny's round the corner. We drove past yesterday. I haven't seen anything about them going bankrupt, but they've taken down the signs outside Frankie and Benny's. My kids were distraught, right? Travel, tourism, these are going to be hospitality. These are going to be big hit industries for sure. But smaller firms make up in the UK about 99.9% of businesses. About 3 in 5 people are employed by these smaller firms, and about 50% of private sector turnover comes from these smaller firms. Again, don't worry about the details for now. All of that is just a way of saying what happens to those small businesses is going to make a huge, huge difference. And that's a big question, right? That is a big question as we come to the end of the furlough schemes and the government guarantees and the lending packages and all those kind of things. What is going to happen to those smaller firms? Number 4 has to do with populism. And I probably have less to say on this point because, I think that we're way too early in the day to mention anything about this or to say anything decisive about this. But there are a number of interesting factors here. I guess my point would be, my question is, what is going to happen politically? Are we going to see political regime changes as we have done in the past? There's a lot of criticism, from where I sit in the UK, looking at Boris Johnson's handling of the crisis. There's a lot of criticism I see of Donald Trump, very similar kind of situation. Again, it's a very mixed bag, I think, depending on which particular leader you're looking at. But, if you introduce things like austerity, potentially, if you introduce things like inequality, there have been some really interesting psychological experiments done over the years about the kind of driving factor behind protests and things like the Occupy movement, for example. And for fairly obvious reasons, inequality is one of the decisive factors. It's when people sit there and they kind of go, hold on a second, how is it that you seem to be coming through this? I'm not just talking about a Jeff Bezos type guy, right? But how is it that you seem to be coming through this unscathed? Your wages have increased, you seem to be protected, and yet I'm suffering and struggling, right? Inequality was a huge issue. I would say probably the defining issue in the UK in the run up to COVID. It hasn't gotten any better with the COVID pandemic. What is going to happen on a political stage after the COVID pandemic, or in this kind of, as we move into the second and third waves and management of that? That's a very big question. Number 5, what about Enron? Why am I mentioning Enron now? From where I sit, a key turning point in previous crises that might be anything close to this has been what I might call the Enron moment, right? That time when a huge firm, a too big to fail firm, if you like, suddenly went bust. Now, we're very aware, I think, at the moment of the kind of firms that are making headlines, that are applying for extra funds and bailouts and all those kind of things. And a lot of them are airlines and other industries like that. But often what happens in a crisis like this is previous, you know, we could call them, if I was being polite, we could call them accounting errors. If I was going to be rude, I could say cases of fraud or manipulation that have been going on over the past 10 years, suddenly come to light as they did in the past. And these firms, they go belly up, they go bust, right? And with that, they have this trigger effect. You know, I forget the name of the bank, but in 1981, 82, there was an American bank, and it was, I think, the Continental Illinois National Bank, something like that. You can Google it, right? And it was a huge bank that had expanded. It kind of went bust. It got this bailout. It changed all sorts of kind of bankruptcy laws and other things like that. But it was the first time, the aftermath of that was the first time that that phrase "too big to fail" was used. And if I think back about, I think about that. I think about Enron in the early 2000s. I think about Lehman Brothers in 2008. You know, is there going to be an Enron moment this time round that could be a trigger for a massive collapse of other firms? We haven't talked yet really about a financial crisis in the COVID era. The Enron moment might bring that about. My sixth point, very quickly, is the global. What about the global recovery? The first video that I did said that a lot of the COVID pandemic and the economic recovery attached to it would be determined by what happens on a global scale, right? There's a big question, I think, about what is going to happen in China and the US. China seems to be starting to get the wheels, cogs turning, whatever analogy you want to use. It seems to be picking up speed. But a lot of what China is seeing at the moment is a kind of a domestic demand-driven recovery. At the moment, China, again, if I go back to those two silly models or ideal types that I said before, the kind of export-driven economy versus the domestic demand one, China is kind of in between those two things. Like historically, up until recently, it's been driven primarily by export and manufacturing and things and overseas trade, and more recently shifting towards domestic demand. This part seems to be kind of getting moving again. Sorry, my jazz hands. Like this part seems to be getting moving again, but the overseas exports part of China's recovery is a huge problem, right? There's big questions about China's export partners, if you like. What's going to happen on that front? China's also obviously going through or starting to see some kind of second waves. How is it going to manage? How is it going to navigate those issues as well? So China is a big question mark in my mind. But I think most analyses that I've seen more recently say that the biggest risk to the global recovery will be the US. I look at Donald Trump, I think the guy's like a bumblebee with a shotgun, right? He's a walking disaster zone. Apologies for, offending Trump fans. But the biggest risk, and I'm not the one saying this, the biggest risk in economic terms to the global recovery would seem to be the US. There's a lot of talk at the moment about cascading bankruptcies in the US. There's also all sorts of firms that had what they call investment grade bonds up until fairly recently that have been downgraded. They're talking about, I think the figures are something like 8% to 20% of speculative grade firms, so firms that had kind of higher risk debt, if you want to put it that way, prior to COVID. 8 to 20% of those firms now seeing bankruptcies over the next 12 months. I mean, these are pretty staggering figures, right? And introduce into all of that the question over what is the US, pardon me, going to do in terms of the trade wars with China? Is it going to play ball? Is it not? All of these things are big factors that you need to bear in mind if we're going to think about the global economic recovery. Number 7, the degree of coordination. I think it's going to be a hugely important and contentious issue, the pace of state of the withdrawal of state aid. You know, the global economy is hemorrhaging. What is seeing us through at the moment are these massive government spending packages. To my mind, there needs to be some kind of coordinated response in terms of how governments decide when they're going to start withdrawing those fiscal stimulus packages, those government spending packages. You know, again, I go back to the Eurozone crisis. I still remember reading the article. I was in a lecture, it was a master's course, I was teaching at Manchester University, and I still remember seeing the Financial Times with an article about a government constitutional reform change that was happening in Germany at that point in time. I think this was April or May 2010, but apologies if my dates are wrong. But I still remember seeing that article, and Wolfgang Munchow in the Financial Times made this point, and he said, you know, what Germany's just done is going to change the course of European history. They have decided to try and balance their budgets, and the only way they're going to be able to do that is to kind of superimpose that on other European economies, Eurozone economies. And he was right. I mean, that was basically, I think, the trigger point for the Eurozone debt crisis. Are we going to see something similar? Are we going to see a lack of coordination in this winding down of state aid? And if so, that could be absolutely disastrous. There are also big questions about, you know, the extent of coordination with climate change and the climate change goals, and can they introduce parts of those climate change goals into these fiscal stimulus packages now? That's a coordination problem, if you like, or question in my mind. And the final one in terms of these, you know, big factors, decisive factors, if you like, is the Zoom economy. Again, I'm 41 years old, right? I feel already like I'm analog in a digital world. I felt that before COVID. I now sit on Zoom calls day in, day out with my colleagues and people around the world who are all sitting there trying to figure out, am I on mute? Am I recording right? Like, what, you know, can you hear me? We're dinosaurs. I didn't feel like a dinosaur, but all of a sudden I do. I remember I lived my teen years in HMV in the 1990s or in Blockbuster. You know, what happened to I know what happened to Blockbuster, but like this is what I remember. You know, I try to explain to my kids now. You got Netflix, you got 10,000 movies on Netflix. I still remember searching through Blockbuster for you know, a good movie from a choice of 10, and with 4 channels on our TV. Right? This is the world that, if you like, my generation kind of grew up in. And I do have this question about, have we turned a corner? Have we seen a watershed moment? Like the online social media thing, that predates COVID, right? Of course it does. But have we seen a turning point now where, you know, for example, the shift towards online shopping, the decisive shift towards working from home, and what is that going to mean? I don't have the answers to that. Some things strike me, though, as pertinent questions. You know, is that going to mean that all over the place there are now huge amounts of office space that are basically going to be vacated, where firms are going to say, what's the point in me paying these fixed overhead costs each month when, you know, we don't need to be here, or we can operate with a skeleton staff, right? Have we seen that turning point? You know, are we seeing the turning point where property prices outside, further out on the commuter belts outside big cities are now going to start to increase because people only need to travel in 1 or 2 days? I think particularly about London, where I grew up. Is that going to be the case? And I think at the other end of the spectrum, what about the service class? What about the people who, you know, they were barely scraping by before the COVID pandemic, you know, for decades, people living out, long way out and traveling in to clean office spaces and things like that, right? Living often in council estates, traveling in for a pittance for hours a day to clean offices early in the morning. And now if those offices are vacated, what happens to that? If you want to call them a class of people, what happens to them? So the Zoom economy might sound all nice and glitzy and glamorous, and I get to do this kind of clever background. I was actually looking around behind me like the background was behind me. I'm analog, I'm telling you, I'm out of date. But you know, it all sounds very glitzy and glamorous, right? But what about the people, what about, if you like, the winners and losers of that process? So I've just talked about, you know, 8 factors there that I think are going to shape the speed, the pace, the shape of the economic recovery with a particular focus on the UK. Let me just talk very quickly about crystal balls. You know, I think that two things are really important factors going forward that are, you know, I don't know if these are questions, these are things that I would, you know, say they're going to be decisive factors. Number one, the economy in the UK was in a very bad shape going into COVID anyway. Like, I think we have to bear that in mind. Let me go not say too much about Brexit. I might end up in tears, but Brexit wasn't doing our economy any favors prior to this. Even before Brexit, before 2016, we had huge investment gaps, slowing productivity. We had an over-reliance on the service sector, on consumption, on imports. We were heavily indebted. We had rising levels of consumer personal debt, household indebtedness. I mean, our economy was not in good shape prior to this. I don't see a way, if I'm honest, in the short term that any of this stuff is going to get better as a result of the COVID pandemic. Sorry to be so kind of, you know, blunt about it, but that's number one factor. And number two has to do with, I think the only answer in a kind of positive sense is going to be, I go back to the first video that I did months and months ago, right? Governments and central banks, the decision by governments to spend, the decision by central banks to lend to governments, these are going to be the determining factors. You know, there's all sorts of talk starting to go on now about, hey, should central banks stop and should we start unwinding quantitative easing, and can we keep on spending at this kind of rate for the governments? You know, governments have got to be willing to weather this storm. They're, you know, getting jittery, pulling the austerity trigger early, raising taxes. These are bad decisions that governments could potentially make in the near future that would choke any economic recovery. You know, there are big questions for central banks. Central banks tend to, if you read central bank reports going into the COVID thing, there were two big things they would talk about, and it's a whole other video to get into these two big things, but inflation versus recovery. And often those things tend to work kind of, you know, you have to prioritize one over the other. The worst possible thing in the world, I think, right now would be for central banks, the Bank of England, to say, okay, look, you know, we're concerned about rising inflation, not now, obviously, but, you know, over the next 6 to 12 months, 18 months, we need to start pulling back these schemes, you know, putting pressure on governments again. You know, the focus needs to be on the other thing, promoting the economic recovery, right, first and foremost. So 8 things we've talked about. We've got to avoid the ostrich effect. We've got to avoid the desire to stick our heads, bury our heads in the sand. 8 factors that I think will play a determining role, but also 2, I suppose, decisive issues in the shape of, you know, thinking about where the economy was prior to this and the role that governments and central banks must absolutely play going forward.